Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on bridging the cannabis divide. Um, Adrienne is going to say a few more words about her practice, but in brief, she is a cannabis attorney. She's been practicing at Cogent for some time, and I am a cannabis banking attorney. Just a few words about my background. I'm a former financial regulator. I was the attorney with the Maine Bureau of Financial Institutions for 8 years. And during my last year there, the 2014 FinCEN guidance was issued, which, as folks on this call likely know, that became kind of the Bible for banking cannabis businesses. And I spent some time advising our regulated entities on what that guidance meant. And then I worked for a financial institution for almost 10 years and started, while there, started one of the first cannabis banking programs in the US. And we had quite a bit of success with that program. No credit to myself. We just happened to be the only game in town for cannabis banking, and it turned out to be a very good source of revenue for us. I have been with Cogent Law now for about a year and a half. While I do offer general external counsel services to credit unions and banks in Maine, I also offer consulting services to banks and credit unions across the country on cannabis banking. And Adrienne, I'll turn it over to you to say a few more words about yourself.
Thanks, Chris. I've been practicing cannabis regulatory law and related corporate and transactional law in Massachusetts since 2018, which is when the regulations governing adult use cannabis were released in April of 2018 in Massachusetts. So I assist clients with the municipal regulatory process, the state regulatory process, as well as capital formation and corporate formation and capital raising issues, such as structuring the partnership agreements, um, creating documents that allow companies to take in, initial investment funds, um, later capitalization rounds, performing required securities filings. And I also do serve as outside general counsel for cannabis businesses once they're operating. And I do have some clients in Washington, D.C. as well, which is where Cogent is based. And I've been a partner with Cogent for about 5 years.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Adrienne. For
Mhm.
those on the call, Adrienne and we actually wrote an article about a year ago on this very subject that we're talking about now. Um, and I know that even when I was in practice as general counsel at a financial institution, I used to get calls of frustration from our CRB member. I'll call them CRB members, cannabis related businesses. I'll call them CRBs going forward, about why it was that we were being so intrusive in terms of getting to know their business and what they were doing. And so I'm going to speak to that for a moment. As a former financial regulator and working at a financial institution, I can tell you that banks and credit unions and their boards tend to be very risk averse. And they tend to be particularly risk averse on matters that in high risk areas. And one high risk area for all banks and credit unions is the Bank Secrecy Act. There are significant penalties that regulators can impose on not only the banks and credit unions, but also on their personnel if they determine that they are significantly out of compliance with their I'll call them BSA for Bank Secrecy Act obligations. So that's a very, very high risk area, uh, uh, compliance area for banks and credit unions. That risk is elevated even more so if a bank or credit union decides that it wants to bank cannabis. Uh, and that's primarily because, as we all know on this call, cannabis is still considered to be federally illegal. Um, and because of that, what happened in 2014 was a guidance that was issued by FinCEN, which is an arm of the US Treasury, a department within the US Treasury. And that FinCEN guidance, it's a fairly thin document, but it imposes uh, quite a few hurdles for banks and credit unions wishing to um, bank cannabis businesses. And basically, they fall into two categories. There's a very enhanced kind of know your customer obligation, both at the outset, and then also that's an ongoing obligation to continue to monitor and update your information about your CRB. But in addition to that obligation, there's also filing requirements. There are SAR filing requirements, that stands for Suspicious Activity Reports. And those suspicious activity reports are very involved reports. There's quite a bit of information contained in each one, and they get filed on a rolling basis for each of your CRBs, each of a financial institution's CRBs, regardless of whether there's any actual suspicious activity on the account. And the reason for that is, again, as I said before, because cannabis is still considered federally illegal. In addition to those SAR reports, because cannabis is still so cash intensive, banks and credit unions have to report currency transaction reports or CTR reports on any transactions any that involve cash over $10,000. So when I was at my financial institution, we our both our SAR filings and our CTR filings uh, uh, increased very, very significantly. And that is very, whether, and, the regulators, when they come in on a regular basis, once every 18 months at least. And one of the first things they look at are those SAR reports and those CTR reports. And that's very low hanging fruit for examiners. They're looking A, to see whether they're filed accurately, B, whether they're filed completely, and C, whether they're filed timely. And if they're not, that is going to raise the eyebrows of your examiners. And again, put your financial institution at risk of getting a low rating on your BSA. Uh, and what I should have mentioned earlier is that following these exams, banks and credit unions, they get a very, very detailed report card. And if you are deemed to be unsatisfactory with your BSA program, that will affect your management rating, which no financial institution really wants. So, Adrian, maybe you could talk a little bit about you have a number of cannabis clients, and maybe you could talk about some of their frustrations or issues having to do with banking.
Sure. So I think what you've discussed kind of touches on a little bit of it in terms of you were mentioning enhanced KYC. requirements. Um, in order to open a cannabis bank account, you often have to provide a lot of documentation up front, which basically is an additional administrative burden to cannabis companies that, particularly in highly regulated states like Massachusetts, already have very significant administrative burdens, regulatory burdens. Um, this would either fall on the owners if it's a very small operation, or if they have somebody that supports them administratively, it would take up that person's time, or sometimes it can fall to the attorney if the client is does not understand what's being requested, doesn't recognize the documents being requested, which then is, an additional expense to an already expensive endeavor. So it's much more difficult than it would be for a cannabis company to open a bank account. It's much more difficult than it is for just a federally legal business, because there's so much more of um, a burden on the banks themselves to ensure that cannabis companies are not criminal enterprises, essentially. And then, finding a bank can be very difficult. In Massachusetts, we're fairly well banked. There's, over a dozen banks that will support cannabis companies, but that is not the case in every state where cannabis is legal on some level. And, probably a lot of people on this call know that cannabis is legal, at least in some medical aspect, in 47 states and 3 territories. So many, and Chris can speak about this more, but like many cannabis banks have the ability to bank clients that are not located within the state where they're headquartered. So I think that has provided some additional relief in terms of a lack of banking services, but it's just a much more complicated process than one would anticipate if they didn't know what was about to happen when they tried to open a bank account as a cannabis company. So at that stage, when you're opening a bank account, cannabis companies are just starting to get going. They're trying to do a lot of things at once. So it's also kind of like a crunch time issue where they're trying to get all of these pieces together at one time, and it can lead to some frustrations.
Yeah, thanks for that, Adrian. Yeah, essentially, it's a risk management decision on the parts of boards as to whether or not to bank cannabis. And Adrian, speaking to your point about some banks uh, uh, electing to take cannabis accounts nationwide. Again, that's a risk management decision that a bank will make. Most banks and virtually all credit unions will have sort of a restricted field of membership for taking on CRBs. But again, that's a risk management decision. Sometimes it's governed by the bylaws of the bank or credit union. And again, another frustration that I've seen is banks and credit unions that have initially taken on CRB accounts and not really realizing what they've gotten themselves into, not realizing the risks and all of the work involved. And I think that one thing that banks and credit unions need to be very mindful of if they're thinking about getting into this space is that they need to be patient. It's going to take time. And I always subscribe to the view that you've always got to get your compliance ducks in a row first, and the revenue will then follow. And so it does require patience and a long view, particularly on the part of boards. So, um, one of the risks associated with cannabis banking, and I view this as a lower risk now, and I'll explain why in a moment, but one of the risks is reputational risk. And I think the reputational risk isn't so much in banking cannabis anymore. I was recently at a conference in New Mexico, and I asked everyone present there whether any of the banks or credit unions had lost any customers or members as a result of their decision to bank cannabis. And I was met with resounding silence. Uh, that had not happened. So I used to view kind of reputational risk as kind of a medium risk. I now put that in a very low category. Um, I think the real reputational risk with cannabis, getting back to my earlier point, is starting the program and realizing you've gotten yourself into something you didn't realize, and then shutting the program down. Uh, no, no CRB wants their bank or credit union to be their last boyfriend or girlfriend. They need a stable financial partner. That's really very, very important to them. So I think that's where the real reputational risk lies. I think one of the big roadblocks that banks and credit unions have in deciding whether or not to even get into cannabis banking is not really knowing what the risks are and not really knowing how important or how not important some of those risks are. And I have always viewed the risks, the three major risks, as being the compliance slash BSA risk, getting, as I mentioned earlier, getting downgraded with on your BSA program at an exam. I think that by far and away is the most significant risk. And then I view the other two risks as being significantly smaller, and that would be the reputational risk, which I've just described. And also, there is a legal risk. There are technical arguments on the books that, because cannabis is federally illegal, that by deciding to accept these accounts, a financial institution is aiding and abetting in the commission of a federal crime or committing a RICO violation. I have always viewed that risk as minimal in the extreme, and I'll explain why. I really do not see any federal or state prosecutor having any kind of appetite to go after a bank or credit union that has made the decision to safely vault all of this cash that would otherwise be on the street. And by allowing these accounts, they're also promoting fiscal responsibility on the part of their CRB members or customers. So anyway, that's I'll get off my high horse when it comes to risk. Um, and I'm going to talk a little bit about one other matter here, and that is, what exactly do financial institutions require when they bank CRBs? What Adrian had talked about, all of this documentation that needs to go across. And first and foremost, they need to make sure that the CRB is duly licensed and in good standing with their state uh, cannabis regulator. That's probably the most important thing. And that needs to be kept up to date, that licensure status. And then second behind that, they're also looking for any derogatory, negative information about either the business or whether it's under investigation or has been or subject to prosecution, or it's beneficial owners. They're looking, and that again is something that is monitored on an ongoing basis by financial institutions. And again, I think probably the most time consuming thing that, Adrian was talking about, all the time involved. I think one of the most time consuming things is getting all of their financial information on an ongoing basis and making sure there is some correspondence between the business revenues that are being reported by that CRB and the deposit activity in the account. Because if they're not, if those figures are wildly askew, that is going to raise some alarm bells with the bank or credit union's BSA team. So I think that's let's maybe we can move on to something else, Adrian. Um, the
Yeah.
Yeah,
Do you
you
want
go
to
ahead.
I've seen some different things on my end in terms of the various services that banks that serve cannabis businesses provide. It's the what is available is kind of a range, and it seems to differ by institution. So, what do you think is kind of standard? What are the services that a cannabis business should expect to receive from a financial institution? Um, as kind of a baseline.
Sure, yeah. I think the vast majority of those who that are serving CRBs, and again, that's a pretty small minority of overall banks and credit unions. The depository services. They need to have to be able to deposit their monies and to be able to have a transactional account from which they can conduct business. I am, and the FinCEN guidance, and probably most people on this call know this, the FinCEN guidance doesn't distinguish between the different types of services that banks and credit unions offer. It talks throughout that document about financial services. So that would include, um, to my mind, that includes both depository and lending services. So even though there are a still relatively small minority of financial institutions serving these industries, uh, there is competition on the market now. And so, these financial institutions are in a state where there is some pressure on the fees that they are charging, but also, again, I hearken back to my days when I was a general counsel at my FI. I was getting calls on a weekly basis, at least on a weekly basis, from our CRBs asking for lending. They were really desperate for financing to get their businesses up and running. And I was hearing some nightmare stories about some rates that their private lenders were charging them. So there is movement afoot now on the part of those financial institutions offering depository services to start moving into the lending space. Um, and as I said before, even though the FinCEN guidance doesn't distinguish between lending and depository services, there are additional risks associated with getting into the lending space. Banks and credit unions, they're creating a stickier relationship, which is a good thing on one hand. But at the same time, if things start to go south with the CRB, there are, additional underwriting and particularly collateral risks associated with cannabis lending. So, but I would say that there is a small but growing interest in offering lending services to cannabis banks, but the majority are still just offering depository services, the transactional deposit accounts.
So, in terms of the lending that's available, like I know that real estate based lending has kind of been permissible for quite some time. If you're able to separate that out as a separate transaction, are banks now moving beyond just real estate backed lending to kind of more general business loans?
They are, and again, it's a risk management decision that each board needs to make. But if they are getting into the lending space, they're looking firstly at the real estate, and that they're looking at very conservative valuations of the collateral based on non-cannabis use, and they're also looking for very conservative LTV or loan to value ratios in order to mitigate the risks as much as possible. Personal guarantees are almost always required
Hmm.
on these loans. There are some that again have moved into uh, uh, equipment as collateral, but again, the equipment and the spaces are being valued based on non-cannabis use. Again, that's what I'm seeing generally.
I mean that I can see how that makes sense. So I'm assuming that the lending is basically only to probably operational and profitable cannabis businesses, right? Not maybe if you're non-operational, you'd be able to get a real estate backed loan, but is that correct? You kind of not
Yeah,
interested in lending to
absolutely.
anyone that's
No,
not making money.
that is absolutely correct, and a very obvious point that I should have made at the get-go. Yeah, I always when we were going back and forth on cannabis lending at my financial institution, I was an advocate of this notion of carrots for compliance. In other words, if that CRB is doing well in providing all of the documentation, information that's needed for the BSA team to make its SAR filings over a certain period of time, say over 2 or 3 filings, 6 or 9 months, then that would be an inducement, to offer the lending thereafter would be kind of an inducement for them. And I think as a former regulator, that's a pretty good thing when you're offering an incentive to CRBs to be compliant by saying, hey, if you comply uh, over 6 months, 9 months, a year, you may be a candidate for lending. But also to your point, they're looking for they're looking for CRBs with a very good financial track record, and they can get that, because they're if they adopt this carrots for compliance approach, because they'll be getting the CRB's financials, and they will have a fairly close look at those as part of its CRB, as part of its BSA obligations. So, yeah, absolutely right, Adrian. And I don't think you're going to, if you're a CRB that's just starting off, you're probably not going to find a bank or credit union that's going to offer you a loan right now, unless it's backed by real estate.
Now, I have a follow-up question in terms of, taking loans that are collateralized by some part of the business. How does the bank, in the case of a default, how does the bank avoid owning property that it's not permitted to own under state regulations?
So there are state receivership laws
Okay.
and you can apply for a court order that will allow, under some state laws, that will allow a bank or a receiver acting on behalf of the bank to hold those assets, at least temporarily. So that would be the avenue for that
Okay.
bank or credit union to do that.
That would probably, I think, would probably reduce the risk a little bit for the bank to
Absolutely.
create a little more distance between themselves and the actual business
Yeah.
undertaken by its client.
Yeah. My general view on collateral for CRB loans for banks and credit unions is that it should be tangible and it can't be plant. Those are the two main rules. And again, there's a kind of an order of of risk in terms of the collateral, the real estate itself, and personal real estate. Those are probably the safest forms of collateral. Um,
Hmm.
and
Interesting.
then, yeah, building collateral. But there may be other assets too. I mean, using uh, accounts as collateral that having guaranteed accounts would be another avenue for that too. Adrian, why don't we talk a little bit about how the cannabis. There have been some recent developments with on the cannabis front. And I am going to speak about the rescheduling thing in greater depth in about a week with the Association of Cannabis Banking, but maybe we could talk about the rescheduling announcement that was made. I can talk to that a little bit in terms of how that might apply to cannabis banking. Again, there's going to be a more in-depth conversation about this in about a week's time. And the first question is, is this going to happen at all? I mean, there was an announcement made by Trump at a press conference, I think on August the 11th, which said it was in response to a question from a reporter. And I think he said they would be considering uh, moving cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, and that a further announcement would be made in the next few weeks. And we've not heard anything more since then. Um, I think that
Right.
is going to invite some confusion on the part of banks and credit unions in terms of what that means for cannabis banking. And I am going to speak in greater depth about that in a week or so. So if folks want to sign up for that through the Association of Cannabis Bankers, please feel free to do that. Um, One question I think that one of the what are some of the red flags that banks are looking at uh, when a CRB comes and says, "Hey, I want to open up an account." So what are some of the red flags, and what are some of the good signs that a bank is looking for there? Um, Adrian, you hit on one of them already. Are they an established business? Have they been in business for quite some time? Which, from both from a compliance and from a financial perspective, is a good thing. If they've been bank hopping, that would definitely be a red flag.
Hmm.
Um, and there is some degree of information sharing that goes on between banks and credit unions on regarding uh, BSA concerns. So a bank or a credit union could make an inquiry on a CRB if it had just left a bank.
Hmm.
Uh, that would be one kind of immediate red flag. The disposition, I think this is often overlooked. The disposition, uh, when you are during that initial interview with your CRB owner, are do you get a sense that they are going to cooperate with these obligations? And we talked in our article that we wrote about a year ago about how similar these banking and cannabis are. They're both probably the most highly regulated industries in the U.S. right now. So because they are so highly regulated, they should understand that, banks also are highly regulated and that they need to go through these hoops and hurdles in order to compliantly bank bank their CRBs. Um, Adrian, maybe you could talk a little bit about the evolution of the cannabis industry. And, I think in our article we talked, at least in Maine up here, it used to be
Sure.
very kind of unsophisticated folks who took great pride in their farming ability, but weren't all that sophisticated on the financial side. How has that been for you?
Yeah, that's definitely I mean Maine is is every state is different, right? But I think that the maturation of the industry has, and the kind of expansion into to include multi-state operators has brought in people with, higher levels of business sophistication. Um, and certainly just in highly regulated states like Massachusetts, it's very difficult just to even progress through the municipal piece on your own. For example, I don't think that Maine has the same. I'm not sure how extensive the vetting process is for like planning boards. Like if you have a piece of real estate in an area that's not very heavily settled, I don't know if you need to get like 10 different government employees permissions in order to, because my understanding is with the original medical license in Maine that it was vertically integrated and that you could actually do it out of your house. So it's very different zoning requirements in that jurisdiction than in a place like Massachusetts. My understanding is that a lot of the, sort of, I can't speak exactly. You're much more of an expert in Maine than myself, but like from what I've studied, um, kind of a larger implementation of the desire to bank cannabis businesses stemmed from the legal industry in Colorado and really feeling like there was a public safety issue and that banks needed to become involved in offering a service to essentially protect the public and serve these businesses, which were now state legal. Um, I'd say so for certain states, it's really going to depend on kind of how complex it is to do business in that state in like just to begin with. Like my understanding is, for example, like in Oklahoma, I think they issued 5,000 licenses at once. I can't imagine that there was a ton of vetting that was done prior to issuing those. Again, I don't know what kind of municipal requirements you had to meet. I know that they're shutting many of those down for the inability to comply with regulations or hiking up renewal fees, et cetera. Um, but so there's a lot of variation by state. Um, but I think the other thing that increases the level of sophistication required for anybody to enter into the industry is it's tied to the regulation of the state in that how much money are you going to need in order to start your business. That may require you going to kind of professional investors who are going to be looking for, um, cannabis business owners that already have a certain level of experience and sophistication before they're willing to kind of make um, what may be an uncollateralized loan or an equity position. Um, so I think it varies a lot, and then in terms of changes within the states, there's kind of a life cycle of states that just open, the states that just open for adult use have kind of a boom of opportunity for new businesses, for service providers that service those businesses. And it's like a bit of a rush. Then you get to a point where the kind of the industry is starting to kind of gain some momentum, and you'll have kind of more, I don't say regular business activities of kind of taking in amounts of money just to support initial growth or expansion. And then there tends to be a point where there's something close to approaching or reaching market saturation, where you then have a more mature market and the transactions, and this is the case in Massachusetts, instead of seeing funding of initial businesses, you're seeing more mergers and acquisitions transactions where an initial owner is deciding to kind of, cash in, essentially hand off the business to a new owner that has some ideas, or someone saying, you know what, I've been doing this for 8 years. I'm moving, or I want to pursue something else. So, depending on kind of where the state is in relation to its legalization of adult use, is going to determine kind of who is involved in the industry and the kinds of transactions that are occurring in that industry.
Yeah, your point about the state laws varying so much is a really, really good one. When our program started in Maine, it was just we had medical caregivers. They were only allowed 6 patients. They could grow in their backyards as long as they had a fence that was 6 feet tall. That was the security requirement. And but that changed, drastically year over year. And I think one point that's worth mentioning is that if you are going to be banking cannabis in different states, you really do want to have an eye on the regulations and and in particular the regulatory changes for each of those states. So, get something on your a Google search for that and
Right.
make sure that somebody in your department is keeping up to speed with that. Adrian, you had also mentioned the service providers and
Right.
the growth of all of these ancillary businesses that aren't actually plant touching, and I think that's a really good thing to talk about now. So, there if the one of the questions that I'm always asked with my clients is how do we treat ancillary businesses? And my first question to them is, how are you defining them? You
Mm.
really do need to, uh, uh, and there is some guidance out there about what type, what's an ancillary business and what's not. I generally go by, kind of a threshold in terms of the revenue derived from direct CRBs, plant touching CRBs, or the number of the overall number of direct CRBs versus your overall number of clients. Those are things I think that are worth looking at. But then after you've defined in your policies and procedures, after you've defined, what is and what is not an ancillary business, how are you going to treat those from a compliance slash BSA perspective? So that's again something that I can certainly assist financial institutions with. A lot of this is not in writing, and it's you're basically your examiners are looking to see whether or not your program as it relates to indirects is a reasonable one from a risk management perspective.
Yeah, I
Adrian,
have a
yeah, go
follow-up
ahead.
question about that. So let's say I'm a like regular insurance provider that provides insurance to businesses, and I decide, hey, I want to start offering insurance to plant touching cannabis businesses. What do I need to tell my bank?
Great question. And again, as I just said, there's no real uh, guidance on this, no writing on this. And it will depend on, I would certainly, I have a certain threshold in mind in terms of number of customers and number of clients that would deem you to be an indirect uh,
Okay.
CRB. But that bank or
Hmm.
credit union may have a very, very different approach in terms of what's direct and what's not. The argument, is that, Walmart is an indirect because it sells Miracle Grow. I don't accept that. There has to be a reasonable threshold for what an indirect is. I think, if you're my personal view on this
Yeah.
is that, if you are an insurance agency with hundreds of clients and you've got one or two, a very small number of clients that are CRBs, that again, from a risk management perspective, if I were a senior risk manager at a bank or credit union, that would not concern me, but that view might not be held across the board. So I think the first question is, whether you tell them. And
Chris, you're not supposed to say things like that.
yeah, but yeah, I mean, disclosure, just, your relationship with your bank or credit union is a very confidential, sacrosanct one.
Yeah.
You should, I always err on the side of over disclosure. So
Yeah, I mean, I would hesitate to start taking money from a cannabis business without my bank being aware of that fact, just because from what I understand, the potential consequences, you just may lose access to your account, um, kind of by surprise.
correct.
So, and
And
I'm
that has happened.
I'm assuming like if you're dealing with a bank, I mean, I guess there's a lot of different factors involved, but it sounds like kind of this goes back to just the overall risk assessment of what is the what is the strength of the tie between this business and the cannabis industry, and how does it impact the bank?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit like looking at the face of a marble piece of stone. You don't know what's behind there. And the cannabis industry has become so intertwined with other businesses, legal, accountants. You know,
Right?
you're it's gotten to the point where you're probably, particularly with larger professional firms, you're going to find it difficult to find one that doesn't have a cannabis client.
It's a
Uh,
good point.
so yeah, and again, I err on the side of over disclosure.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I think it's 12 minutes left.
Yeah, we've got 12 minutes. So do we have any questions?
I don't know. I don't want to.
Yeah,
Let's see.
please don't be shy.
I don't see any right right now. Hmm. Oh,
Okay, I think there might be some questions, and
waiting to receive
we're
them,
waiting on them
perhaps.
right now. So we do have a question here from Kevin Hart. Did you see the article that Mass is contemplating rolling back adult? I have not seen that. Adrian, are you aware of that?
I'm not really sure what it means by rolling back adult. Um, let's see. There's a link to an article.
While you're considering that, I can talk about the next question that came up about the rescheduling. Do you think that rescheduling would prompt an update to the FinCEN guidance? So there has been much criticism, particularly in legal circles, about the fact that FinCEN has not already updated its guidance. It's now 12 years out of date since publication. James Cole was the uh, keynote speaker at the PBC conference a few years ago, and during that time, he very publicly lamented the fact that his guidance, which kind of formed the basis for the FinCEN guidance that was published 7 years ago, created kind of this unduly restrictive regime for banks and credit unions. And in spite of that, very public lamentation, we haven't heard anything from FinCEN about this. I think a related question to that is whether, or one thing we haven't talked about yet is whether, what are the prospects of the Safer Banking Act passing? And, you can see the weariness in my face when I mention the word Safer Banking Act because it's been languishing in Congress for so many years. But that's certainly on the table again. The question to my mind is whether, if rescheduling were to move forward, what effect would that have on the prospects of the Safer Banking Act passing? And you could argue that, well, we've got a more friendly Congress regarding cannabis and that it could very well pass. The counter argument to that is, well, if perhaps rescheduling takes some of the urgency off the Safer Banking Act moving forward. So again, I am, I'm long enough in the tooth now to stop trying to predict Washington and Congress. So I don't know the answer to that second question. But
Yeah, so I can just jump in
yeah,
regarding
please
this
do.
revocation of adult use sales. This article in MJ Biz is talking about a potential ballot referendum which still has not collected enough signatures in order to be actually put on the ballot. So, what I can tell you is that having somebody submit initial paperwork prior to qualifying for a ballot referendum does not at all indicate that they will get enough signatures or that it will be voted for approval. And I can say also that the Massachusetts legislature has been very busy over the last, I don't know, 6 months or so, um, introducing legislation to modify the way that the cannabis industry operates, making significant changes. They've had, I think, 4 different public hearings. They've received testimony from all sorts of different groups. So I will say that based on the legislature's actions, they are certainly not planning on the revocation of adult use, if that is any indicator for what is going to happen in the future. So it's again, in order to submit initial paperwork to get a ballot referendum included, that is in no way indicative of how whether you're going to get enough signatures and how people are going to vote on it. So it's interesting that MJ Biz picked that up, but um, I I don't think many people are preparing for that to come to pass.
Okay, yeah, we've
So
had sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yeah.
no, go ahead. You can take the
I'm just
next
looking at some
one.
of the questions are coming fast and furious now. So let me just pick one of these up randomly. Uh, pum.
We got a question about how fast could rescheduling happen.
Yeah, so there are 3 ways that rescheduling could take place, and I'll be speaking more about this in a week. Uh, as was previously attempted by the Biden administration, it was through rulemaking, and there would have been a notice and comment period, and that process usually takes between 6 and 8 months. As everyone on this call likely knows, that was stalled for various reasons that I won't get into here. So that's one way. There is some precedent for this too about rulemaking without notice and comment, and that would take place fairly quickly. And the third avenue would be legislatively. There was a congressman in Florida, a GOP congressman in Florida, who has introduced legislation called the 123 Act. which would reschedule cannabis legislatively. So those are the three ways of doing it. I think the most likely way is rulemaking with notice and comment. But again, I've just put myself in the boat of trying to predict Washington, so I shouldn't have done that. But that would be my guess anyway. Um, the There was another question here about best practices for onboarding cannabis customers. Uh, I'm, if people want to reach out to me, I can give kind of much more in-depth answers on this. But you don't want to wing it. You're going to want a script. You're going to want an onboarding a CRB onboarding document, uh, and with the questions, and obtaining the licensure, and finding out, what type of CRB they are, the number of customers, their types of customers, and what their expected deposit activity is going to be, what their expected transactional activity overall is going to be. That is extremely high level. So if folks want to reach out to me and get some more in-depth answers about that, I'm more than happy to help with that.
So there's a question here. How can smaller CRBs leverage social equity initiatives to build stronger banking and investor relationships in a changing federal landscape? In Massachusetts, there's a social equity fund. So, I mean, the first thing that you would want to do if you're a social equity applicant is get officially qualified by the state. You have to submit, documentation demonstrating that you're eligible for that status. You then have the ability to apply for funds that are made available through the social equity funds that the state's established. So that could help you for investor relationships by A, being certified as a social equity applicant, and B, already having some kind of seed funding. Usually, the most difficult money to get for your business is the first money. People don't generally want to be the first investor. So if you can demonstrate that you have some funds available for at least, the very initial things that you need to have done, such as probably submitting your application to the state or, securing initial real estate, through a lease or an option to lease, things of that nature. That is kind of how you would leverage the social equity program. And then obviously kind of demonstrating, um, if you're able to get social equity status from the state, that's going to demonstrate to your banker that you have the ability to, be aware of and comply with the complex regulatory framework of the cannabis industry in Massachusetts. So that's going to kind of make you look like a better applicant, kind of pursuant to what some of the things Chris said.
Yeah, the whole social equity initiatives are kind of interesting from a BSA perspective because you are from a BSA, when you do your due diligence on your beneficial owners, you are going to find some criminal history on them. And if you're a BSA officer and you're operating in a social equity jurisdiction, again, it's a risk management decision, but you'll want to look at the specific, crimes and how long ago they took place. Just because they've got some criminal history should not uh, preclude them from a banking relationship. So that's an important point to make to consider from a BSA perspective.
Right. And for some, at least for one prong of being eligible for social equity, it can be, I think, your spouse, your parent, or your child can have a conviction for related to cannabis, excluding diversion to minors. So it may not necessarily the social equity status. And then another way is if you've lived in an area of disproportionate impact for 5 out of the last 10 years and have income not to exceed 400% of the poverty level, that would also qualify you in Massachusetts, but every state is different. And yeah, if you can get the state involved in kind of validating you as a business, that would certainly help the bank um, deal with its obligations to vet people with a potential criminal backgrounds.
Yeah, the actual licensure speaks volumes. I mean, if the state's willing to give the licensure, then that's a pretty good indication that your bank should be allowing the account. Well, we've come up to our 1 o'clock deadline. We had some great questions on this call. And Adrian, thanks so much for all your input. Great presenting with you today. Really enjoyed that very much. This was Adrian's and my first presentation together. And as you know, our practices dovetail very much. So we thought this joint presentation would be a good idea for folks. And our email addresses are there on the slide. And I kind of pride myself on being very accessible to folks. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me by email with any follow-up questions. And I know Adrienne well enough to know that she's kind of the same way with her folks too. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and hope to see you back again sometime.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Chris. It was fun. I learned something. Thank you.
Thank you.